Well, welcome, and hopefully more people will filter in. But welcome. I'm delighted that we could make this happen. Cindy and Kathy and Martha are folks that I've been working with in different capacities for a while now, and I remember when they first released their 3-volume Human Rights Home hardback book that is a fantastic series, and I have a copy in my office if anyone wants to look at the full series. And then they had been in conversations, and then I had the good fortune of talking to Peter. And I don't know whether, Peter, you had talked to Martha before I talked to you, but the timing worked out that we were sort of having the same conversation at the same time about Penn Press doing the abridged paperback version, which is out and here and available, and a wonderful book that looks at the history of human rights in the United States. And really provides a useful background. I think oftentimes our history lessons kind of leave out this piece of the discussion. And even our discussion of the civil rights movement leaves out a lot of the discussion of the human rights and where sort of the civil rights movement tried to interact with the UN systems and what happened. And as we've been working, we've got probably the 3 leaders of the Bringing Human Rights Home movement here at the front of the room for the 21st century. But as we've been working on bringing human rights home and talking about using the human rights framework in our domestic advocacy, having that historical context I think has been really useful for me in thinking about things as I frame issues. And so having this as a resource, and then it does, of course, I got lucky, I don't know, I didn't have any say in this, but the chapter that got included as the substantive chapter was the labor rights chapter, which is the area that I work in the most, so that made me happy. But so I'm going to let them speak, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time for questions, so hopefully you all are here prepared and armed with questions for them, and have a discussion. And I don't know what order you all want to go to, but we have Cynthia Soohoo, who's the legal advocacy Director of Legal Advocacy. Is that right?
Legal Director. But
Director,
yeah.
Okay. Director for the Center for Reproductive Rights. And Martha Davis, who is a professor at Northeastern Law School. And Kathy Albisa, who's the Executive Director of the NESRI, National Economic Social Rights Initiative.
Very good.
And I'll turn it over to them.
Okay, so just so that we wouldn't make you just listen to us, we decided we'd start with this short video of something that's happened more recently after the book, but I'll explain why later we want to start with it. Other than I like videos.
This is my first time being home. I always had kids up for 21 years, and I had a job too.
Empty buildings are a crime. Landlords need to do some time.
There are people out there with no electricity, no running water. We're in the year of 2009. Their houses are run down, but because we're proud people, we will still live it. We will make the best of it.
Stopped working. I worked all the way from the time I was 10 years old. I was nearly homeless. And I heard that a deal had been made between a developer and the County of Los Angeles to put in 10 units of affordable senior housing. Because I didn't want to live in my little old wrecked up car.
The wrecking ball has come to Washington, D.C. Underrepresented, underhomeless, disregarded, and disenfranchised. There
the second storm. We call this the dry storm. We lost our communities and neighbors who was just as close as family, not due to the storm, but to the government policy.
The last question and a half, I have to break the news to my father. How does a child tell their father that we are about to lose our home?
My thing is, we just like everybody else in this world, you know. We live like everybody else, you know. We human beings, you know. You know, our human rights have been violated in this world time after time.
Our people have to give up the keeping the housing became an issue and a problem for us. Not enough, never enough housing for our people.
You would pay rent 30 days later. Now, you don't pay it, you're out. And so everything now is being ratcheted to make sure you get out, because it's a lot easier to sell an empty building to another investor than it is a full building, because then they have to take over the rent control tenants.
People are not losing their houses here in, you know, Wilkes-Barre or my hometown or whatever because there's a lack of houses.
The only ones that can do something about are you. You are the only ones. You are the only ones that live here. You are the only ones that vote. You are the only ones that organize, that mobilize, that fight against, that resist, that have hope. So you are the only ones that can really. My presence here is a presence to tell you that you should not give up. That all the struggles and all the things that you are seeing now and feeling now is that you are right, that it's not a matter of losing hope in the change, because of course change is possible when more and more people are committed to change. What I can do, and then what UN can do, I can echo your voices. But in order to echo your voices in a loud way, I need your voices. So it's very important that you stand up, that you stay up, and you keep on shooting, so we can also echo your voices, and perhaps by doing that we can help you.
Okay, now I gotta figure out how to turn it off. Okay. I don't know.
We're not going to use that again, are we? Good
Okay,
to have the
no,
whole thing
I
public?
just, somebody
Yeah.
better with technology than
Okay.
me, make that go away. So I thought I'd start with the video because while the major issues, you know, sort of the most visible issues of the day changed, the fundamental dynamics and structures in which these crises happen don't. And I wanted to start, because we did the book a while ago, I wanted to start with something to remind us that, you know, while some of the post 9/11 stuff still very relevant but winding down, and Katrina seems to start fading, which are the two flashpoints in the book, there are other crises that come up that show us that our rights infrastructure remains, let's just say, far weaker than one might hope. And that is one of the reasons activists across the country have become interested in human rights, and it's one of the reasons a group of us, the three of us as editors, but many more authors and other people who gave input and ideas, wanted to put this book together, which was a much longer series at first, which I'm really glad now you can pick it up without needing to do weights, because the first one was too expensive and too big. That came out now in this abridged version. That was part of the reasoning. As the book shows, there was a history around human rights and activism in the United States that needed to be reclaimed. You know, the articles in here that go back to the early part of the century or before, that kind of demonstrates there's always been a desire, a hunger, an interest in social movements in the United States to make human rights part of our social contract, part of our social fabric. And for a long time, that history was not easy to see. And one might even argue that there were a lot of people that intentionally wanted to obfuscate that history. At the same time, when we started working on the book, that there were people out there, like some of the authors in the book, Carol Anderson, et cetera, who were reclaiming that history. There were people reviving the work. You know, there were lots of organizations that had started to shift towards a human rights framework, lots of organizers who started to change their message, lots of coalitions and alliances, and even institutions of learning like this one who started to turn towards the notion of domestic human rights as a very important organizing principle for social justice in the United States. And so the book seemed to be an opportunity to put together those efforts that reclaim the history and with those efforts that were reviving the work, and show that what's been happening decade after decade and perhaps century after century in this country is really more of a continuous human rights struggle that gets sort of lifted up and then submerged again, and that it's part of a long cycle, but one where we believe and hope we do see progress going forward. The other thing about when we put the book together, we were in an atmosphere under the Bush administration of very intense US exceptionalism, right? So there was a strong rejection. It was one of the periods where there was a very strong rejection of the notion of international standards or human rights being relevant to the United States. And while that, as a rhetorical matter, has died down with the new administration, and while some of the extreme manifestations have been muted around the edges, what's important to remember, though, is that the basic structure on which that exceptionalism sits hasn't really changed. And so today, although we've ratified human rights treaties in the United States, there are no real avenues for enforcement. Today, even though we're more aware and have more learning every day about global jurisprudence and comparative law, it is still not the norm for courts to reach out and be part of that global dialogue and weave that into their jurisprudence. And today, there is still a deep resistance in the United States to many substantive key aspects of basic human rights. You know, one of those areas is economic and social rights, where with the exception of education, there's still pretty much a wholesale rejection of the notion that government is responsible and obligated to meet very basic human needs. There's also a rejection of broader definitions of discrimination and an unwillingness to look at the structural aspects and the institutional aspects of discrimination that go far beyond the kind of intent-based discrimination which the Constitution addresses, and even far beyond some of the impact discrimination which some of our legislative frameworks address, but to really look at, you know, the way our structures lead to discriminatory impacts and outcomes. So this but because human rights embraces these broader substantive notions, there are a lot of organizers and activists that have been drawn to it and continue to be drawn to it. As I mentioned earlier, the early civil rights movement, even prior to that, up to today, as you look at the housing rights movement, showing enormous enthusiasm for the Special Rapporteur's visit to the United States. That was the UN Special Rapporteur on Housing. It was the first official visit to the United States. There was tremendous involvement in her visit, and there still remains a lot of excitement about what to do going forward. But it's not just the idea of addressing gaping holes, these substantive gaping holes that draw activists to human rights, and the idea of implementing them domestically. It's also the nature of human rights in international law, which is somewhat different than domestic law for two reasons. One is that the obvious one, which is it's supranational by definition. It goes beyond the political construct of the state, and speaks to something far more basic, right? Something that defines us as being human. And because it's grounded in that notion, it's also then front loads the idea that it's based on a set of values that we can come together around and that we can see as universal, see as relevant to all peoples and all struggles. And this is also something that is very compelling for a lot of organizers and activists here as well as elsewhere. It connects struggles, it connects people across borders. It's the kind of law it is. And it's also the kind of law because of the structures in which it finds itself, right? It's not just courts, agency, and legislatures. It's a lot of monitoring and reporting. These create also platforms for dialogue. So that is the kind of thing that organizers and activists also find very rich about human rights law. You can find ways to engage with it in broader social spaces beyond the courtroom. So the fact that it's a set of values, the fact that it transcends the state, the fact that there's these mechanisms for real social dialogue that can catalyze change, in addition to the substance of the standards, these are all things that have drawn activists and that we try to document how they've used it, in this book. One of the things that if you remember from the video, at one point she says, you can make the difference, right? We can only echo your voices. Well, when we initially filmed that, we cut off a little piece of it because the first time that this was shown, it was in Geneva. And she starts out by saying, what can the UN do for you? And she answers herself, nothing. And then that's when she goes on and you see the rest of the clip. Considering that the first place we were going to be showing this was in Geneva as an aside event for the General Assembly, we decided that we might want to cut that section out. But it's important. It's important, and it's not just, on one level it's disappointing, but on another level it's actually important in a very positive way. And it says something about the way people engaging with human rights see human rights, right? That it's not just about that institutional space, the UN. It's about people of conscience, people impacted by violations, all coming together and making human rights part of their community, right? And I think that's what she was trying to get to with that. She wasn't just trying to say, don't ask me for too much. She was trying to say, this is what human rights is about. It's about social movements owning it. So human rights is, for all of the preceding reasons I mentioned, a very good place for social movements to meet law. It's a very good bridge between law and social movements because it's not the kind of law that depends on the sort of heavy hammer of enforcement, but rather the kind of law that catalyzes dialogue, as I said earlier, that provides that platform, that helps us tell a story, right? Because it becomes part of what the movement's about. It helps us construct a broader overarching narrative within which the various social movements can work and unify. And instead of that heavy hammer of enforcement, what it does is it sort of ignites, right, with its vision, with the fuel it brings. It becomes that thing that ignites change, that thing that ignites action. And so it's a much more complex and nuanced view of what law is within society than perhaps what we're taught in the traditional classroom. And I think for all those reasons, we thought it was important to try to capture those various strands, both in broader analysis and in some specific examples. The 3-volume series also has a number of very specific case studies, some stronger, some areas aren't as developed, but you can sort of see how these things manifest themselves and why such a wide range of people within the activist community have come to becoming invested in this notion of human rights in the U.S. So I'll leave it at that and turn it over.
Okay, great. Thanks to Sarah and Peter for inviting us here. We don't, because I'm in Boston and Kathy and Cindy are in New York, I don't get to see them too much, so this is nice. And also, of course, it's St. Patrick's Day, and so in Boston we call March 17th Evacuation Day. I don't know if any of you are from Boston, and it's the day that the British troops evacuated Boston during the Revolutionary War, and it just happens to be on the same day as St. Patrick's Day, so all government offices are closed down there, so I'm not missing anything in Boston. And also appropriately for this occasion, this is also Bayard Rustin's birthday, and he died in 1987, but he would have been 99 today. And probably, at least some of you know of Bayard Rustin's work and legacy. He was a behind-the-scenes leader in the civil rights movement. He served as the primary organizer of the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and it was that gathering, that march, where Martin Luther King delivered his I Have a Dream speech, where particularly talking about economic social rights. Rustin himself was a committed pacifist. He served for 2 years in prison rather than register, not just serve in the military, but rather than register for the military. He was a lifelong Quaker. He was a member of the 15th Street meeting in New York City. He was very active in the American Friends Service Committee, which is based here in Philadelphia, so probably spent a lot of his time in Philadelphia. And he was a human rights activist. And so even though he operated within the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, he viewed the movement through a human rights lens, and he rejected identity politics at a time when many people embraced that approach. And in fact, near the end of his life, he wrote, quote, "The principal factors which influenced my life are 1, nonviolent tactics, 2, constitutional means, 3, democratic procedures, 4, respect for human personality, and 5, a belief that all people are one." So it's very appropriate that we're discussing bringing human rights home on Bayard Rustin's birthday. And given his appreciation for the relationship between human rights and civil rights activism, he actually appears as a key figure in the historical essay that Kathy mentioned by Carol Anderson that's in our book. And this also reminds us once again of what Sarah referred to at the outset here, that the roots of the human rights movement in the U.S. are not recent at all, but are really deep and intertwined with more familiar American history. So we know about the civil rights movement, but we may not know about the connections it has to the human rights movement and to human rights perspectives. The same is true of the movement for women's suffrage, of the movement, the abolition movement, even of the revolution itself. It's rarely presented in those terms. And so those are some of the themes that we try to draw out, particularly in the historical section of the book. Now I want to say a few words. I was assigned today to say a few words about one of the ways that human rights becomes real in the U.S. And that, I think, is when it becomes embedded in our law, not just at the federal level, but at the local level, close to home. And this is a key avenue of enforcement. Kathy was talking about the difficulty of enforcement of human rights, but a key way that happens is through actual adoption of human rights norms on the local level. And over the past 12 years, there's been some significant activity in terms of state and local initiatives on human rights. To just look at CEDAW, there's some municipalities that have adopted the Women's Convention, CEDAW, as their law. San Francisco adopted it in 1998 as part of its municipal law. Los Angeles adopted it in 2003. And in California, several counties have convened task forces to implement CEDAW and have coordinated across counties to discuss implementation. Now, this was before the budget cuts, and the budget crisis that they have there. So I think that's affected their ability to do this work. San Francisco, meanwhile, leading the way as the first municipality to take this step, is now looking at the issue of private accountability of corporations that do business with the city under using the local CEDAW as the sort of mechanism, the platform for doing that. There's some other good examples of local human rights implementation. Chicago has adopted standards of the Children's Rights Convention through a municipal resolution. The Massachusetts Commission on the Status of Women is statutorily charged with implementing the Beijing platform in Massachusetts. In Pennsylvania, there was pursuant to a legislative resolution, there was a commission here that reviewed the state's compliance with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and held hearings around the state and came up with a report about that issue. In Eugene, Oregon, and Kathy had some involvement in this, they've proclaimed themselves a human rights city, and the local Human Rights Commission is leading an effort to fully integrate human rights into city laws and policies. So these are, all sort of nice examples, from big cities and then from not so big cities of how this kind of activism is moving forward to create a more immediate and enforceable kind of idea of human rights norms. But it's not that long a list. When you're talking about a decade or 12 years of activism since, for example, the Beijing conference in 1995, which kind of was a catalyst for some of this effort to bring human rights home. I'm sure there's some examples that I've missed, but I also think it's true that direct state and local incorporation of human rights norms in domestic law is not easy, and it's not universal, certainly. So even though the ordinance was passed pretty quickly in San Francisco, actual implementation has been sporadic as funding has come and gone from the San Francisco Commission on Women, which is the implementing organization. Efforts to enact CEDAW and CERD in New York City have stalled, in part because of the mayor's opposition. Efforts of grassroots groups in liberal Massachusetts to create a true human rights commission have so far gone nowhere. So why? Why is it that these efforts haven't caught on more generally? And I think it's not necessarily that state legislators and municipal council people don't care about human rights. If you look at the Darfur divestment campaign, the Burma investment restrictions, the anti-sweatshop movement, there's a lot of energy around many of those movements, on campuses as well as in state legislatures and municipalities. But these efforts seem to have moved relatively quickly, like the anti-apartheid divestment campaign of the past, while local efforts to incorporate more general and basic human rights norms and standards seem to be more difficult. And one reason may be that the Burma and Darfur campaigns are more traditional views of human rights in the U.S. in the sense that it's about them and not about, not so much about us. It's about our investment strategies, but not about our human rights violations. Not about examining U.S. culpability in those areas. So it's easy to target them. Another reason may be, though, frankly, is that local human rights implementation, while important in terms of making human rights norms real in the U.S., may not be immediately transformative in the way that that would be energizing. In San Francisco, for example, it hasn't always been easy to identify specific results of the local CDAW. There are some. They did a gender analysis of a number of the city agencies, rather, and as a result of that, they determined that in many dark areas of the city, women felt uncomfortable if they were working at night or had reason to be there at night, and so they realized that they should put streetlights closer together. It's a very tangible thing, result, but not one that seems transformative. They adopted different work hours for public works staff to accommodate childcare hours so that individuals, predominantly women who had childcare responsibilities, would be able to access those jobs. So these are important for individuals, but they can seem like small results, nothing dramatic, small and close to home. Even though these things had proven to be very difficult to accomplish in other ways because they involve what some people call second-generation discrimination, in that it wasn't overt, it wasn't sex-specific, but it had a disparate impact on women. So the problem can be that grassroots groups want concrete results, and with scarce resources, they need to know what's in it for them. It's hard to articulate. Principles like equality and dignity may not seem like the right kinds of things to rally around. And likewise, state legislators or local municipal officials may be suspicious. What do these principles mean in the real world? Am I voting for something that's going to give foreign nations the right to define our local standards? And so there's a level of suspicion. But maybe, on the other hand, maybe we shouldn't worry that much, because direct implementation of human rights norms isn't the only route to making these real in the U.S. Judith Resnick teaches at Yale, wrote a brilliant article, which I now understand is being turned into a book by Penn, right, as soon as she completes it, and called Law's Migration, published in the Yale Law Journal. And she suggests that human rights norms and international standards find their way into state and local law anyway. They migrate as part of the movement of ideas across the globe and across the country. So maybe we don't have to despair that there's only one San Francisco. And importantly, we have some examples domestically where non-laws, things that were not laws, had huge influence on the development of domestic law. So, for example, the Equal Rights Amendment, which never became law in the U.S., but had a huge influence on the development of actual law under the Equal Protection Clause. Or the international rejection of the death penalty. Obviously, it's not binding law in the U.S., but the international position has had a significant impact on the on decisions of judges, federal and state judges. So the moral may be that instead of measuring progress on U.S. human rights by toting up specific local resolutions and laws, we should be looking for ways that the spirit of human rights has been recognized and implemented locally. And so an example of that might be the Massachusetts same-sex marriage law, the Goodridge case, where the court didn't appeal directly to human rights. But the fact that this was accomplished through the courts, that's one of the ways in which human rights law migrates. And again, there's no doubt that the court was influenced tacitly by human rights considerations. Likewise, the greater transparency in government, we were talking about this in the hallway a little bit earlier, that may serve human rights goals, with the Obama administration coming in and being at least more open to engaging in that kind of dialogue than the prior administration was. I do want to add a word about the importance of content, that participation of those most effective is an important human rights value, but I think the danger is that human rights norms may be viewed as solely about process and just good government, because the substantive provisions may may require more work and even longer process in order to achieve. But if activists push only substantive aspects of human rights, they may encounter greater resistance than they do if they say what we want to do is have a meeting, a commission, some participants in a group that may seem more or less threatening than something that's focused directly on substance. So there's a delicate balance, but I think it's not either or. That laws are not only about process or good government or about substance alone. And so it's kind of a false dichotomy, and I think it's one that lawyers in particular need to be thinking about, as we're the ones who are often in the position of formulating these laws. The most powerful laws relate directly to individuals and communities through both substance and procedure. And local communities, more than other corporate entities, resonate with the human rights message. So in closing, I want to acknowledge the organizing power of human rights and its ability to transcend the substance versus procedure debate. And the clip that we just viewed shows this particularly, I think. So you have grassroots groups and folks that are empowered and emboldened by the language of human rights, by the concepts of human rights. And Bayard Rustin had something to say about the affirming nature of human rights norms. According to Rustin, quote, when an individual is protesting society's refusal to acknowledge his dignity as a human being, his very act of protest confers dignity on him. So I think we can see in the clip that Kathy showed that, and we know from experience that the conference of human dignity is something that comes through the human rights struggle, that effectuates the conference of human dignity. And it's a critical piece, an organic piece of efforts to move human rights norms at the local level. So.
Thanks. I'm going to move this, I don't know. Hi, everyone. I'm Cynthia Soohoo. I am the director of the U.S. Legal Program at the Center for Reproductive Rights. And before that, I was actually the director of the Bringing Human Rights Home project at Columbia Law School. And I mention that because when I was at Columbia, a lot of what my job was really to talk about human rights strategies and try and get U.S. lawyers interested and excited about them. And I'm just wondering, how many people here are lawyers or law students? Okay. Because I actually think, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, but if you think I'm wrong, but I actually think that social movements, activists, they get human rights. And actually the people who have the hardest time getting human rights are lawyers. And I think, you know, and maybe I think, you know, and we talk about this some in the book, but I think sort of part of it is historical and part of it is related to our conception of what the nature of the work that we're doing and what it should look like. I think, you know, the whole idea of domestic human rights, I mean, maybe it's not so weird now, but I felt like when we were writing it, it was strange. And I think because in the United States, there's sort of a view that progressive lawyers who work on issues in the United States are civil rights lawyers, and human rights lawyers are lawyers in the United States or elsewhere who work on issues in other countries. And I think that that sort of has gotten ingrained. I mean, when I actually went to Penn, and I'm thrilled to be back here, I was interested in doing public interest work, and I was sort of thinking about, well, you know, should I take human rights law? And I'm like, I don't even know if we had human rights law, to tell you the truth. But I don't think I would have, because I was interested in issues in the United States. And, you know, it was hard for me to see what the relevance is. So I think that we sort of see this in the legal profession, and this is sort of a larger manifestation, I think, of what we call U.S. exceptionalism, right? This idea that international human rights or human rights is not about the United States, it's really about what we tell other countries to do. So that's sort of one barrier to overcome. But I think when I would talk to U.S. lawyers about trying to use human rights strategies and see if, you know, any of these things resonate, I mean, like the responses, I would get resistance. And I think part of it related to patriotic notions that the U.S. legal system was the best legal system in the world, right? And that, you know, it's really about us sharing our constitutional rights and our fundamental rights with other countries. I think so we really had no need to learn from other countries. There was nothing, you know, the rights were not more protective. There weren't more mature legal systems. There was nothing we could get. I think there was also in the United States a historic reliance on courts. So it was sort of this idea that any kind of profitable social advocacy strategy would begin and end in the courts. I mean, I think maybe that's an oversimplification, but I think for a lot of lawyers, there's sort of the sense of, well, why do you engage in these international human rights bodies, you know, when you don't get anything that you can actually enforce? And I think the last thing was the sense that international pressure doesn't work in the United States, that we are sort of, you know, that we're a superpower, you know, and we don't want, you know, Chad to be telling us what to do. And that in some ways that it might backfire if you're trying to engage with international organizations. But I think you know, a lot of things that we talk about in the book really change people's attitudes about human rights. And I think part was sort of historically what happened, the war on terror. You know, this idea that all of a sudden in the United States people could be making arguments that you know, arbitrarily detaining people might actually be legal under US law, and are saying that, you know, human rights law maybe didn't apply, or trying to change what human rights law meant. I think also Katrina made a fundamental change. And Katrina, I think, was interesting. I think 9/11 was really about us sort of saying, you know, were we scaling back on our commitment to fundamental rights? And Katrina was about us noticing the things that we actually never thought of, right? In terms of, you know, what were the voices, what were the rights that weren't part of our legal and social fabric? I think the other thing that lawyers had to come to grips with was the growing conservatism of US courts, right? That maybe, you know, in the 70s it was really exciting and you could actually make a lot of difference, maybe, through a legal strategy. But, you know, increasingly I think US lawyers were getting frustrated by bringing cases in courts that were dominated by Bush appointees. And so we're sort of seeing our ability to make change in the courts narrow. And then I think the other thing that we sort of saw was the development of the international and regional human rights systems. So I think, you know, in terms of what went on internationally and the way that international human rights bodies developed and sort of became more robust, right? The way that international human rights strategies and methodology had advanced in terms of thinking about doing human rights reporting and other things. So I think those things got more appealing. And the last thing I think is just the globalization we've sort of seen across all sectors. And we started to see that also in the courts, in terms of courts being more interested in looking to opinions from other countries. So these are the things I think that led to a greater openness to human rights in the United States. And I was just going to say, you know, I mean, we actually don't have that much time. So I was just going to say a few words about, I think that the book actually has a number of themes, you know, and they talk about how human rights relates to social movements, how it relates to legal education, how human rights has been used successfully or unsuccessfully in US courts. But one thing I'd like to talk about is the US's engagement with the international human rights system. And I think this is sort of a story of, you know, there's some good news and then there's some bad news, and it's a constant back and forth. I mean, one thing that's really an important thing that I think we need to take away from the book is that the US had a profound and founding role in starting this whole international human rights system. You know, the founding UN documents were really in part based on the Four Freedoms speech of FDR and the Atlantic Charter, which was really FDR and Churchill's sort of vision for a post-World War II world. And that the US NGOs, including the NAACP, were really the groups that really pushed to make sure that human rights were part of the UN Charter. And so, you know, I think the United States was all over this idea of international human rights. But what happened was, when it actually came time to engage in these human rights systems and think about, well, we're going to ratify human rights treaties, there was immense resistance. And the reason for that, I think, is in the United States was no different than any other country, right? Because we actually had human rights problems and we didn't really want to face up to them. And I think the first convention that came up for ratification was the Genocide Convention. And you would think, after World War II, you know, the Genocide Convention should be a no-brainer, right? But there was Senator Bricker who led an opposition to the Genocide Convention, and he talked about isolationism and sort of had a lot of anti-international rhetoric, but a lot of what it was really about was this fear of creating an international human rights mechanism or accountability that would look at segregation in the United States. That would, you know, in the South there was sort of discussion about whether they were going to pass federal anti-lynching legislation, right? And states were like, well, we don't want the federal government to tell us what to do. They really didn't want the international community to tell them what to do. And I mean, you can see this in the rhetoric around the Genocide Convention and the other treaties. They were talking about how ratification of the treaties might lead to abolition of laws banning mixed marriages. You know, so it was sort of all over this movement to not ratify treaties. And so Bricker actually started this movement to say that if we were going to ratify human rights treaties, he would actually try to take away the power, change the treaty ratification process. So there was this amendment called the Bricker Amendment, which basically would have undermined the president's power generally to enforce or ratify human rights treaties. And sort of faced with this faced with this attack, Eisenhower and his Secretary of State Dulles decided that they would make a deal with Bricker and that they would just say, we're never going to offer another human rights treaty if you stop this movement for this amendment. And so until the 1990s, the U.S. just didn't engage. We didn't ratify any human rights treaties. And it was only after the Cold War, I think in 1992, that the U.S. ratified CERT. I think that was the first. And then, and then in the Clinton administration, we ratified 3 human rights treaties: the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention Against Torture, and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of race discrimination. And this was significant for the United States. But I would say, and there were some efforts in terms of thinking about, well, what does that mean for the United States? So the Clinton administration actually created an executive order that would have talked about creating a federal government infrastructure that would think about, well, what would it look like for us to really comply? But nothing really happened. And I think it partly that the Clinton administration got sidetracked with other things in the second half of its term. But also, that maybe still the ratification might have been more about the U.S. trying to engage with the international system because of our foreign policy concerns and not really taking seriously human rights abuses in the United States. And so then we sort of enter the era when the book was written, which is the Bush administration, which was an era of extreme isolationism. I don't know if people remember, people were calling French fries freedom fries, like we didn't want to have anything to do with France. There was crazy resolutions that were being introduced in Congress saying that federal courts should never, ever look to international sources in interpreting the Constitution. Thinking about that they look at law review articles that people write, it's kind of ridiculous that they wouldn't look at decisions of high courts from other countries. And the Bush administration was also saying that they didn't want to participate in the UN Human Rights Commission, and it was just a time of engagement, except for one thing. The Bush administration actually, for the 3 treaties that we ratified, the Bush administration decided they would engage in one respect. The treaties actually require that countries who have ratified the treaties report to UN human rights bodies. And it's supposed to be done like every 4 years. So the Bush administration actually made it a priority, I think, to become current on these reports. The thing about it is the attitude I think that they adopted was not a good one, because I think, and Sarah and I have actually been involved in a lot of these treaty reviews. It was sort of, you would go and the Bush administration officials would say, well, we're doing really great. And there was really no attempt to engage and talk honestly about what the problems were. So now we sort of fast forward and we have the Obama administration. I think the signals are different, right? The Obama administration really talks about it wants to be a human rights leader. We are part of the new Human Rights Council, which replaced the Human Rights Commission. The Obama administration says it wants to take these UN treaty reporting requirements seriously. And in part what they've done is they said they want to engage with civil society and they want to actually hear about real problems when they write their reports before they engage. And that's good. I mean, Sarah's actually sort of spearheading or organizing a lot of this work. There's still kinks to be worked out, and we'll see. I mean, I think one broader concern the NGO community has is it really about the Obama administration wanting to show that we're human rights leaders, and it's really about the rest of the world, in terms of we're going to engage, we're going to ratify human rights treaties, and not really a serious attempt to think about what are the human rights problems in the United States. So I'll stop.